Okay, so in the last class what we were discussing was we were talking about different different topics from this chapter, and today we are on the last phase of the lesson. So it's only a few points that is left, and only the biodiversity conservation part is left. So we'll be discussing that, and that will be the end of this chapter. Okay, so aji heading kora biodiversity ba conservation strategies. So in the last class we have talked about something called as IUCN red list. Then we have talked about the different terms like vulnerable species, extinct species, etc., right? So today we are talking about this, and whenever we are talking about conservation, or whenever we talk about conservation, there are two words that comes to our mind. Either it is ex situ conservation or it is in situ conservation. So how will you conserve? Either you will go for ex situ conservation or you will go for in situ conservation. As far as ex situ conservation is concerned, one of the questions that is more commonly asked, a portion that we have already studied during our living world, that was the most common question. I think you remember taxonomical aids is something that we have studied, and while we were discussing that, botanical garden part 2 ami porhisilu. Botanical garden or pra eta question ahisil, what was the most frequently asked question about botanical garden? It's a means of dash type of conservation, in situ conservation or ex situ conservation. So it's a means of ex situ conservation. So that was just a point to remember, that we have already studied the term called as ex situ. Okay, just in a very simple language, what is the difference between the two words in situ and ex situ? Conservation is of two types, in situ and ex situ. What is the difference? Either you will conserve the organism in its natural habitat, or you will take the organism from its habitat and conserve somewhere else, and accordingly we have those two terms. If you find an organism and you conserve that organism in its own habitat, that is called as what? In situ conservation. And if you take the organism away from its habitat and conserve it in a proper place, then it is called as ex situ. So similarly, at a heavy list likha. So in situ or ex situ. Now how is the question asked from this chart? out of all these points, a little bit of details we need to study about Biosphere Reserve, and rest of the topic is just few names that we have to remember. Biosphere Reserve, common details of poribo layer. Now, the question that is asked from this chart is, the question could be like, National Park is an example of in situ conservation or it's an example of ex situ. Similarly, the other question could be botanical garden is an example of in situ conservation or it's an example of ex situ. So, please read the chart carefully and just see within in situ ki ase or within ex situ kuntu ase, right. Maximum question has been asked about this also, right. Hotspot is an example of in situ conservation, right. And Biosphere Reserve to ami korim. If this is over, heading koriba Biosphere Reserve. Are you new? Tumi notun niki? Aji first class? Botany first class ne aise hole first class? Botany first class korisa no? Eto chapter to already ami ekdom last class ase, ha? Aji to dhora hardly ek ghonta manor class na lagibo niki, it's a very short class karon last or pine to baki pdf kin loi loba, pdf loba, video lectures kin loba, doubts kini collect kori pelai muk khudiba, ase aru kunba notun ase niki nai no? Okay. So, Biosphere Reserve, what are the points about Biosphere Reserve? The first point is, as I have already said, it's an example of in situ and ex situ, heteropod question ahe. Next, talking about a Biosphere Reserve, no, it is an area where organisms or where animals are conserved and they are kept protected, right. It is nothing but a protected area, right. So, another point that you need to remember is, whenever we talk about a Biosphere Reserve is divided, or the entire location is divided into 3 areas. If I say this one is a Biosphere Reserve, yar bhitor ki thakibo, all the organisms and different types of animals will stay here naturally. Since this is an example of what? It is an example of in situ conservation. It is not like this that someone has made it and brought the animals from outside and conserve. They were there from before, and this is the area that we conserve, right. Any area that is supposed to be called as a Biosphere Reserve is divided into 3 zones, right. So, 3ta zone thake yate, eneke 3ta zone thake, thik ase. This zone is called as a core zone, the most important part of that habitat, right. It is this area where you will see different forms of organisms. The number of organisms will also be more. That's the first. First, what you need to know, what is the name of the first 3 zones? We'll be writing it down. Next, talking about these 3 areas, maximum organisms or maximum animals, kuntu zone or pam? It's in this core zone, right. Another point about the core zone is human activity is not allowed, right, and no one can go to this zone provided you don't take a permission. Suppose if permission loi pelai jaba tetihale jabo pariba. Without taking a permission, you cannot enter the core area of a Biosphere Reserve, right. So, what are the things? Maximum organisms, human activity not allowed, right, and if you have to go, you have to take a permission. Those are the 3 points you remember. Next, the second zone, one is called as the buffer zone and the other is called as the transition zone, right. So, in these areas, what happens is, je yate ki hobo, slight or very little human activity is allowed, and when I say very little activity, we are generally concerned with people going to that area to collect maybe logs, woods, etc., or maybe they can pick up the fruits from the trees, etc., right. Or from educational point of view, you can go for research, for educational work, etc., etc., but in this area you are not allowed to go. After this, we have the third area. This area, maximum human activity is allowed, and when I say maximum human activity, what we understand? First, forestry, you can go and plant trees. Agriculture, you can do that, and apart from that, the most important is settlement. People can go and make their houses in this area also, right. So, these are the 3 zones that you need to remember, nothing as such. So, what are the points you will remember? Nikha? Okay, from these points that we have written, how many zones? First point. Second is this word, multiple use of land is permitted in, multiple use of land is permitted in a biosphere reserve. Next, what is a biosphere reserve? Obviously, it's a protected area, nothing to remember. Next, this one, the number of biosphere reserve in India, because we'll go by the NCRT, and according to the NCRT 14 India hai. No doubt we know now it's 18, but in spite of that we'll be studying only 14 about that. If the question is asked what is the number of BP, then you have to say that it's always 14, right? 18 is a belek kotha. Talking about these, core zone or eta line likha. Core zone, buffer zone or transition zone. মই লিখি আছো ৰবা, লিখিলে তুমি আকৌ ধৰিব পাৰিবা, ঠিক আছে? হা, just to have an idea jodi lage. So, another statement is written in your PDF in the last page. If suppose if you have about Biosphere Reserve, tat likha ase tribal people are an integral component. ঠিক আছে লিখি দিব পাৰা. These are the points that you remember. Was there anyone asking me a question? Quoi? REK, NOK, REK, NO. I couldn't get your question. Please ask. কোনবাই কিবা খুদি আছিল নেকি? এটো নে সুন্দরবন ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গল তলৰটো দেখিছানে নাম্বার 4 or 5? Okay. So this is all about Biosphere Reserve that you have to know. Nothing much to study. খালি তিনটা জোন মনত ৰাখিবা. Then the area protected area. Next is tribal people included. In the 3 zones, the one sentence that we have written, right? Next is, since we are talking about in situ conservation, one being Biosphere Reserve, the next, ekhini aru khali information likhibo lagibo. There is nothing to explain in the next part. All you have to do is just write and remember it. There is nothing to, explain. So this was all about the first one, Biosphere Reserve. Second, likha sacred groves. Just example. Is this part over? Take it to কি কৈছে হা স্পেলিংটো ইয়াত লিখি দিওঁ KHECHEOPALRI Pulri second ব্ৰেকেটৰটো দেখিছানে And as far as the pronunciation is concerned, I don't know. How do you pronounce? Chiopalri, you speak out the K also. No idea. Ki kore? Pronounce jana ne kunubai? How to pronounce this one? Chiopalri or Kechiopalri? Kechiopalri, na? This is, I mean, it's not silent. Okay, whatever. Remember the spelling and give it in the exams. Okay, next is national park. The first point, there's just only one point. Actually, this part, na, some examples of national parks, some examples of wildlife sanctuary, or maybe biosphere reserve, this is something GK oriented. Okay, so it's not necessary that you read each and every line, or maybe whatever points I give, it's not that the question will come up from that point only. These two lessons, no, biodiversity and conservation and environmental issues, you need to do some work from the net also. Latest information you need to take out, right? Because we'll be talking about certain type of summits that are conducted, no, world or kisman summit hoy, kisman meeting hoy, no, to preserve or to conserve the biodiversity, no. So accordingly you have to like search the net and take out the important information from there, because whatever information is given in the NCERT, it's like long years back, right? So can you questions that ahibo, question to latest report to ahibo pare, thik ase. Example aru ki diba, amar khone diu Kaziranga ti dia. लिखा है जी जी जाना सबे जी जी लगा सब लिखा Nandi. So this is the information that is given. What you do, serve the net, latest information kin likhi loba, theek ase. Because the question might be asked, if the word recent is there in the question, then you have to answer it accordingly. If the word recent is not there, then we'll stick to this number. Okay, so side recent information ulai loba.
Ma'am, 14 Biosphere Reserve se ase ma'am, eta to 18 ase. Ma'am, jodi option duta thake 14 18
যদি word recent বুলি নাহে তেতিয়াহলে 14 এ দিম কাৰণ NCERT বুকত 14 এ আছে ৰাইট তেতিয়াহলে আমি 18 নিদিও কিন্তু recent বুলি যদি দিয়ে তেতিয়াহলে 18 দিম generally question about 14 only it will come because the teacher will also be referring to the NCERT book only to check the question, right? হ'ল ন নাই পা হ'ল নেকি Can I rub? Richest and most threatened areas. It's an area where you will see different types of organisms. The number will be more. If number is more, then obviously they will become threatened also. So this was all about in situ conservation. What is in situ conservation? Conserving the organisms in its own natural habitat is called as in situ conservation. Examples of in situ: national park, wildlife sanctuaries, hotspots, biosphere reserve, etc. etc. Sri Lanka kyo? Sri Lanka kyo? No, Sri Lanka is not a part of India, no. I don't know books to tat teneke likha ase, but what we understand from this line is maybe they are referring to that area, the entire stretch India pra Sri Lanka le jiman khini area ase no, that area, not specifically a part of India, not specifically a part of Sri Lanka, within the two countries jiman khini area ase, that area is considered as a hotspot. Okay. So if this is over, Situ Conservation heading koriba. Aru yar bitorot Norman Mayers etur upor question ahe, who has developed the concept of hotspot. Talking about Situ Conservation, we are not going to write much in details because you have to refer to the chapter called as Living World. There we have discussed a topic called as botanical gardens and zoological parks, and there we have written certain points about it. What is a botanical garden, right? The first form botanical garden, India Keta botanical garden ase, each and every information has been given in that chapter. So please refer to that chapter. Okay, living world junkhini ase, and similar is the case for zoological parks also. Questions from that, especially from zoological parks, the question is not very frequently asked, hardly there, just one statement whether it's an example of in situ or it's an example of ex situ. That's the only one I think it's asked about zoological parks. As far as botanical garden is concerned, botanical gardens are, that question is so very important, in situ ne ex situ. So that's the first line that you will remember. Apart from that, the first form national park in the world, right, the first form national park in India, right, the different types of national parks found in, the different types of botanical gardens in India. For example, question might be asked like this, Lloyd Botanical Garden is located at, right. These are the informations that are given in the Living Worlds chapter. Please go through the notes and write it down, right. Just few points we are going to write. Yeah, this one, Pollen Bank, pollen grains bilak jot conserve kori thobo pare no, right. So since we are using the word bank, so we understand that this is something that is artificially made, no, human se banai se, so it's an example of ex situ, right. You can store the pollen grains of the flowers for generations or for years after years, right. And especially when we are talking about this part, no, this and this we understand, when we are talking about especially a bank and where you preserve all this, maybe we are talking about the gene bank, we talk about germplasm conservation, or we talk about pollen or seed bank, etc. I think you have heard something called as cryo preservation. Hunisa no? Cryo preservation, liquid nitrogen, yes. So you generally store it in what, liquid nitrogen, and that process is called as cryopreservation, and that is what is the technique that is used generally in the banks. Pari, in any form, right? Either to be tenike form or there are so many ways, no? Dry ke koribo pare ba tumi liquid auto thobo pare. Nitrogen auto tumi dry ke thoba. Sporopollen kon ase no? No, pollen or. Pollen or sporopollen is to highly resistant, no? So it's hardly at that duration of garden to be preserved koribo pariba. In vitro conservation mane? In vitro, you conserve in a in a lab, in a specific test tube or in a petri dish with special type of nutrients, etc., etc. That's what's called as in vitro. Right? So this is all about the chapter. Oh no, we have something called as conservation. Okay, I can likhe le. Do all of you have the PDF of this chapter? Nizor usort ase niki PDF kini? You all have? So I think if you have the PDF, there are certain points that are given in the last part of the lesson. There is no point of writing it down again. We can see it from there itself, right? So if you have your PDF, please take it out. As far as the chapter is concerned, the chapter is completed. These are the portions that was included in the chapter. What we have learned in the chapter is we have talked about the meaning of biodiversity, levels of biodiversity, patterns of biodiversity, right? Next, why do you have to conserve, right? If you do not conserve the organisms, what will happen? They will become extinct, they will become vulnerable, etc., etc. The differences between critically endangered, vulnerable, etc. This was the portion. Next, why do you go for conservation? Because they are of economic importance in a broad sense, in a narrow sense, or always, or also in a religious factor also that is behind them, right? So because of these three reasons, we had to conserve. Talking about conservation, how do you conserve? You conserve it either by in situ method or you conserve it by ex situ method. What are the examples of in situ? What are the examples of ex situ? This is the content of the course, right? As far as the rest of the PDF is concerned, these are certain extra points that are given about this chapter. So if you have the PDF, please take it out. It's page number 229. And for those students who do not have the PDF at this moment in front of you, don't worry, since this is the last class of this chapter. By today or latest by tomorrow, the entire chapter in the form of a PDF will be sent to you again. Right? Not only for you, for all the students. Groupot send kori dim gutei chapter to any point that you have missed, you can write it there. Right? Etia tumalokor ase na agot ase? You have it? You don't have it. It was not sent or what? It was not sent. Oh, dates, huh? Doesn't matter. Khali dates kini baki ase no? Dates kini baki ase? Doesn't matter. For the students who have the PDF in front of you, you don't have to write it down again because we are going to talk about those dates that has been mentioned in the PDF. For those students who do not have the PDF, you can write it down. The chapter is over, the extra points. Because as I said, from these two lessons, no, biodiversity and conservation and environmental issues, GK oriented questions are also asked, right? Maybe one example of such a question could be World's Environment Day or World's Environment Day is celebrated on. So you have to know that type of a question is obviously GK oriented, no? So tenuka dhoroner questions kisman ahibo pare. So points buli likha jar PDF ase likhibo nalage, jar nai tahate likha. Now writing all the dates does not mean you have to by heart each and every one, because obviously you don't have to by heart. গোটেই বিলাকৰ ওপৰত question আছে. হা 11th. So অকমান just go through before going to the exam. That's all, right? Because maximum question has been asked about what? Some that's very common. Maybe environment day and all those stuffs, right? Or maybe one mahotsav khudi dibo pare. Not all days. Animal day and habitat day, I don't think the question would be asked.
Ma'am, World Ozone Day 16 September.
16 September. 16 September day আছে না? 16 September. মই 11th লিখিছো. So extra point number 1 is certain dates. Next, extra point number 2. জিম কৰ্বেট ন্যাশনাল পাৰ্ক নাম শুনিছাতো? ক'ত আছে? উত্তৰাখণ্ড. ইম্পৰ্টেণ্ট এই দুটাই. Silent Valley report question ahe kot ase Kerala. Why is it called as silent? Silent Valley is called as silent. Kyo karne? What is a silent valley? It's an evergreen forest in Kerala, right? It is called as silent because it's so silent that even insects are not present. Because generally when we talk about forest, generally at night you hear a particular type of an insect, right? Sound kisuman thake no, tik tik thake no kisuman bostu, kintu silent imane silent je tat insect ko nai tamane. You don't see, hear the sound, so it is called as silent. Oh, Kerala se. Nathake because of the types of trees that grow there. Thik ase, kisuman favorable trees othe tumar insects bor thakibo no. So they don't grow. The type of habitat, it's not favorable. এইটো পইণ্ট নাই পিডিএফত লিখি লোৱা and latest information ulai loba nije right কাৰণ 21 to hoise right it was most probably 11 January 2021 but please I mean take out the facts from the net. In these two chapters, no, conservation and environmental issue, we will be talking about this Earth Summit, World Summit and words like Kyoto Protocol, Montreal Protocol, etc. etc. So, duita chapter milai pelai question to ahe. Question to kene ke ahibo? Je maybe the question could be the Earth Summit is held or it's organized for ozone protection, ne biodiversity conservation, ne environment protection, etc. etc. So, answer to ki hobo biodiversity. So, biodiversity logot related, what you need to know is Earth Summit and World Summit. These two are related for or related with the conservation of biodiversity. Maximum question has been asked about this only. Again, these are extra. Okay, so something called as forest conservation by two methods. Out of everything that we have written, maximum question has been asked about social forestry, right? Question to keneke ahibo pare, what is social forestry? That's one question could be asked, or the question could be asked, growing trees in the roadsides, or growing trees in the community lands, or growing trees on unused farmlands is an example of dash type of forestry, is an example of social forestry. So whenever you hear the word social, you have to remember that we are talking about planting trees in an area which does not belong to a particular human being or an individual, right? It's meant for all, it's the government's land. If you go and plant a tree there, that would be an example of a social forestry. Amar je rasta bilakot divider bilakot diye, it's a part of beautification, it's a part of social forestry also, right? And even in the railway tracks, near the railway tracks, you can see so many types of trees growing there, right? That's also an example of social forestry. So social forestry, ekta word ami monot rakhim. That's all and nothing more than that, right? The question has never been asked as what is agroforestry, huh? Kwa? Okay, agroforestry likha ase woody species are grown with herbaceous crop either at the same time or different times. Woody species are grown with herbaceous crops. Crop field bilakot, I don't know whether you have noticed or not, kisuman fields bilakot ki hoy crop field thake tar maje maje dangor dangor gos rui die. The best example that we can see of this I mean agroforestry is if you have visited a tea garden, right? If you have visited a tea garden, you have seen tea bush bilak thake no, bush bilakor in ba side side dangor dangor gos thake na thake, right? So that's an example of agroforestry. Zoom cultivation, we have an idea, right? Zoom cultivation is practiced in chikunu eta jagar kotha koa northeastern states, right? That's the first word you remember. It is also called as zoom cultivation is also called as slash and burn type of agriculture, right? Or method or shifting cultivation. So yate ami first ki likhim, I'm not short form ot likhisu ha. One demerit of this system, it contributes to deforestation. And the last point is about Mangrove vegetations, I think we have heard that. Example of a mangrove plant, Heritaria, Soneratia, these are examples of mangrove plants. Mangrove plants have a special type of roots called as pneumatophores, right? Pneumatophores have pore-like structures, pneumatophores, right? They are positively and negatively geotropic. They are negatively geotropic because they do not grow under the soil, they will come out of the soil. Why? Because the area in which they grow is very salty, right? They are also called as breeding roots, right? This is the information from the morphology section, right? Okay, so I think this was all the information about the chapter biodiversity and conservation. So we have completed the chapter. In the next class, we will be starting with a new chapter, right? Any doubts? Online students, kiba doubts ase nahi? Okay, I think it's understood. So after this class, in the group itself, the entire lesson will be sent in the form of a PDF. If any point is missed, please write it from there. Have your doubts, collect and send it to me. Okay, thank you.